La, la, la.
I just have a little green light. All right, well, I guess we can start.
Yeah.
So thank you guys for coming to Daily Castles Academy. I feel like everybody's pretty familiar with Nick, and I really appreciate Nick. You can introduce yourself if you want a little bit. But I really appreciate everybody coming out. This is something I've been wanting to do for Baby Castles Academy for a long time. And so I'm stoked that it's happening.
No, I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for having me, John. And so I don't know if you've ever been to a comedy show where a comedian comes out with just notes and they just riff on their notes, and they sort of they're gonna basically tell jokes, but it's not really a show. It's more like them taking notes. That's kind of what this is for me. This is an experiment. I'm exploring an argument. And I want to be clear about that because I'm not an expert on what I'm talking about. I'm bringing a lot of aesthetic theory I understand into this, so that's where I think my expertise lies, and I've paid attention to games, so I know a bit about games. So I'm talking about things that are there I know, but the actual argument I'm making right now I don't stand behind very strongly. It's more like a question, right? It's a way I've been looking at things that I want to ask, and it has to do with certain kinds of movements in the independent games community that have been going on for a while that I think are interesting to me as a question of what the intent is in things like curating work of games for the public, and how we perceive that work. And I just want to sort of explore it with you. So if you think that everything I'm saying is stupid, we can have this is a conversation, and I'm not going to talk for all that long. So I want to have a conversation about it, and you should beat up my ideas. Anybody who knows me knows I'm a very big believer in debate. So I'm going to throw hard on this, and I'm probably going to miss a lot, and I expect you to be like you missed and tell me why. Is that cool? All right. So irony or authenticity. So a few years ago, I gave a talk at Indiecade on a game called Cart Life. And it was a well-played talk, which is a series that's run by Drew Davidson out of Carnegie Mellon. And it's basically a talk series that's designed to explore a game deeply. And what's interesting about Cart Life, about this presentation of Cart Life, is I think Cart Life is deeply flawed. I think it's really interesting but deeply flawed. And I told people I was going to do this. And basically my talk in a nutshell was the narrative in Cart Life is unbelievable. Super interesting, well depicted, well told, deep stories that go into very, very complex and ambiguous spaces and sort of question morality in really interesting, challenging ways without a very clear point. And I loved it. It was literary in a way I had almost never seen a game be literary at that time. But the gameplay was horrible in my mind. A lot of it was just doing math under time pressure on a bad interface, which I didn't really like very much. And there were just parts of the game that were just unreadable. Trying to navigate the map in Cart Life just was impossible. I literally had no idea what I was doing when I looked at that screen. And I mentioned this on stage. I talked about this pretty openly. And I threw this slide up. Right? Because I was this is the real problem. And I was trying to talk, and I gave a talk effectively about how what art does when it explores these sort of other emotions that are not positive emotions is it spins them into something that you can receive. It spins them into something entertaining. And if it's not actually entertaining, it kind of fails, right? It's boring or it's painful, and then I don't want to consume it. And I got flamed for this, right? A lot of people called me out for saying this. Now, what was interesting to me about this was that there were a couple of different ways that I got hit for this, right? One of them was that I had been talking about an indie game at all, and that was sort of the climate at the time, right? This was many years ago, not many years ago, but 5 years ago. And at the time, people were much more sensitive about people talking about indie games, and as you know, I've never, ever believed that. I come from schools of criticism where you just beat up everything that came before you, because that's how we make art stronger, right? So I expect to beat up the ideas of my forebearers, and I expect the people who come after me and the people I've taught to beat me up, and that's just sort of how it works. I think art movements move by aggressively denying the accomplishments of past art movements and then stealing from them liberally to make new things. And it's great, right? Nabokov, Nabokov's one of the great literary critics in literature, and this book, he basically spends half the book trashing Dostoevsky. Dostoevsky. Right? And he trashes him unabashedly. And it's kind of ridiculous. Right? Of course Dostoevsky's better than Nabokov's making Dostoevsky to be out, but he's making a point. He's arguing for a kind of literature. So I dismissed that altogether, right? I was just nope, we're going to beat these games up. But there was a second criticism I got, which was really interesting, was that the game was supposed to be boring. That was the point, right? This is a game about exploring the difficult and kind of the lives of drudgery that certain kinds of jobs have, and the point was to create empathy for those jobs, and so it should have been boring. Like, the task you're doing shouldn't be fun. It's not fun to run a cart. So why would that task be fun? And I thought that was really interesting, because to me, as a commercial designer, like, I'm an independent designer, but I'm largely a commercial designer. It was very contradictory. And I saw that argument stringing up over and over again in different places, whether it was like the visual design in Dwarf Fortress, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more later on, which is alienating to most people who play the game, or the driving mechanics in Deadly Premonition, which are just like, despite whatever else you may think about the game, are just like unbelievably difficult to navigate and hard to do, or like a lot of the stuff in Cybele, like the acting or the moment to moment participation, right? Which and on all of these cases, I heard arguments that were kind of similar, which was either that these decisions that were made that were clearly, from a commercial gameplay standpoint, not good. No one was defending that they were good. Like, I'd never had an argument with someone in Cybele that the moment-to-moment interaction of me fighting an enemy was supposed to be fun gameplay. Like, no one ever made that argument to me. They said that the point was that it was supposed to be bad that way, because it reflected an earlier game, or because it wasn't the focus, or because that wasn't what the person was interested in exploring, or because that was the aesthetic. And I would lump these things together in a way, really just from John, this was like your phrase, and I kind of took it because I thought it was really good, as anti-design, right? Like, these are not decisions that were made in the claim that they would be good game design, or based on commercial principles. They were made in opposition to those things. And that's really interesting to me, right? Because that it kind of flies in the face of how I understand art, right? Like, if I'm trying to communicate to you and trying to reach out to you, to deliberately use practices that alienate you is sort of an interesting perspective to take. And I don't quite know what to do with that. And thinking about that got me to where I was. And what's interesting about this to me is that when I start trying to push it and say, like, okay, well, what is the aesthetic that makes this make sense, right? Like, anti-design steps. And I want to be very clear here, and I'm going to talk more about this later on, that, like, I'm not talking about all indie games by any stretch of the imagination. There are a lot of indie games that are very pop sensitive. There are a lot of indie games that are basically commercial games that are made by indie developers. There are a lot of games that exploit these things in ways that use design sensibilities, that are more commercial game design sensibilities, even if they do push boundaries. I'm talking specifically about games that we all know what we're talking about. Games that, like, are deliberately pushing against these sort of basic design considerations. Now, my experience with this is kind of like, it comes out of music, right? Like, my understanding of this comes out of music, and because I was a punk when I was younger, right? I never looked like that, so if you see pictures of me, you won't see it, but all I listened to was punk music, and all my friends were punks. And this was the punk of my era, right? And I picked, they're not the only ones, but I picked these two bands specifically, and if you know these bands, you'll understand why when I start talking. And one of the ethics I had around music, as someone who did not like the pop music of my time and was kind of looking for something else, had to do with the relationship between recorded music and live music. Right? And one of the ethics of the punk scene when I was a punk at that age was that if you couldn't play what you had on the album live, you were not a musician. Right? And, like that idea, this sort of Fugazi-ish dream of, right, like that the live performance is just put onto the record, was like an ethic I had. And so this idea that, like, if I heard music that I knew couldn't be reproduced because it was auto-tuned or because it was a machine, it was sort of mechanically derived in a certain way, it had been altered, that was not good music, sort of, a priori. But that's ridiculous from a commercial standpoint, right? Like, that statement is ridiculous from a commercial standpoint. So this idea of authenticity, right, as being derived from that aesthetic place, was something that was, like, really critical to me as someone who considered myself a punk, but it didn't exist for most people who consumed music, right? And that, like, when I think about authenticity and I try to apply it to the general music scene, I think about this. So this is autotune. This is, I took this as a direct screenshot from a video on how to autotune like Drake, right? So this is, like, literally what Drake does. And, like, they're talking about one of the most successful musicians in the world, and most people don't care. Like, they just don't care. When they consume the music, it doesn't matter. Most people consume that music from a streaming channel, right? So they don't even see Drake live. This is all they're ever going to experience of Drake, is this hyper-altered music. So I have to tell myself, as I think about this, that this authenticity that's super important to me really doesn't matter to most of the audience. Like, they're not perceiving that as value. So by saying that that's important to me as value, by saying that this experience is like what is the most important to me, I've basically isolated my audience. I'm not alone, right? Like punk was not a small movement, but I alienated a lot of the rest of the movement who, when they hear the stuff and they don't hear the polish that they get from something like this, they step away. Oh, no, I don't care. I'm more worried about the recording. I don't know if I should pause when that happens or what. Look how live and real this is. Like reacting with the thing. So anyway, like, so I think about this a lot when I think about like how music is even consumed nowadays, and that like there's a response to this. I think about like Tune Yard's first album or Smith Western's first album with like deliberately low quality production stuff, which was born in part out of just financial realities of the artist, but also there's an aesthetic around that. Like people make first albums that way because there's an expectation, and people who listen to those albums sort of think about them that way. And so is low production value an aesthetic that implies authenticity? When like Tarn Adams talks about why Dwarf Fortress is so like why it's so ASCII crazy, right? He says that the reason why he didn't concentrate on the visual design, he said this at practice, is because he was more focused on the game design and he wasn't going to concentrate on the visual design until that was done. But people have offered him, and this is no joke because I know this from the time, hundreds of thousands of dollars to reskin the game, and offered to do it for him, like to take the code of the game and just reskin it so it could reach a bigger audience, and he refused. Right, and I think that refusal is part of his aesthetic. Like he sees that as authentic to what he's creating, And if you study his biography, it's in his background. Like he played games like this. He like thought about games like this. So could we argue like maybe one perspective I have on these anti-design things is that it's just an expression of authenticity. Of course, the singers don't sing as well. Of course, the recording devices are worse. That's what it means to be punk. That's what it means to be punk from a class perspective. That's what it means to be punk from an aesthetic perspective. That's what it means to be punk from a cultural perspective. But that's like an argument we could make, is that like I respect these anti-design decisions, even though I kind of know they're anti-design, because I accept that aesthetic. And to be authentic to that aesthetic, I have to accept these things. I think you could make a similar argument for nostalgia, right? That if we do a kind of retro game, I'm being authentic to what the retro gaming was. So even though I recognize that maybe there are better features or maybe that machines have better capacities now, I'm still going to accept the constraints of a retro feel to be authentic to that retro feel. That's one way of thinking about it, in my mind. A second way of thinking about it is irony, right? Like maybe what we do when we anti-design is we comment on design. Like we directly speak to design. Because we all understand the design already, so why do we have to follow it? We could break it, right? And I think there's a lot of interesting little games that have done this. This is Achievement Unlocked. It's one of my favorite web games, right? Which is just basically starts off with a super stripped down environment, and then you basically unlock all the features of the game to be able to play it. Right, which is sort of a comment on the gamification of achievement structures and how achievement structures work. You could think about games like No More Heroes and its sort of narrative commentary on gamers and how it thinks about the relationship. I've always been fascinated in No More Heroes by the jobs the main character actually does and the world in which he's an assassin, because the jobs are the most mundane things possible. So like mowing lawns or picking up trash. Right, and there's definitely some relationship to like thinking about a certain kind of player and like the fantasies of a certain kind of player. And if you recognize that, then No More Heroes gets more interesting. Games like Problematic, which deliberately break design conventions to sort of like make a point about prison culture, right? And to showcase like sort of what lack of agency looks like, which creates, this, which is like an almost unreadable screen in places, but like designed for a point. Or, as Matty Bryce talks about in Death of the Player, games like Encyclopedia Fuck Me, which are deliberately designed to like push against our expectations and to hurt us, like to be frustrating experiences on purpose. And I mean, Anna Anthropy knows how to make games. Like if you look at the games she makes, there's almost formalist expressions of good gameplay in certain places. Thinking about things like Mighty Jilloff as like as an expression of a sort of massacre game is like, it's a really good massacre game. It clearly studied other massacre games. So it's not like we could make an argument that Anna Anthropy doesn't know how to make games that are satisfying to particular play needs. She deliberately made this game because she's defying those things. That's an interesting position to hold, right? Irony is kind of a neat position to hold because sometimes you do irony and it works, right? Everybody gets it and it makes sense. And sometimes you do irony and nobody gets it and it works. Right? If you don't know the song, you should read the lyrics. They're excellent. And you probably hate this song, right? But if you read the lyrics, you'll realize why hating it is actually kind of great. But on the other hand, then irony cannot work. And I'm always reminded of the scene from Man on the Moon, the story, sort of the biopic about Andy Kaufman, and how Andy Kaufman made this like television program that he put on air. And there's a point in the television program. And remember, this is during like the 70s when like televisions were still like a lot manually controlled. The vertical hold of the television appears to break, right? Like it looks like the vertical hold means that like on old TVs, like the image was fixed in position by a dial on your screen, and it could slip out of position, and you'd have to tune it back into position. And when you did that, you'd see this like bar of static appear on the screen. And so during the show, a bar of static appeared on the screen and then drifted back up. And when this happened, the producer who's in the room walks up to the TV and starts turning it, and Kaufman and his partner just start laughing at him. And he's like, why are you laughing? The TV's just out of balance. He's like, no, it's not. We just did that. That's not real. And the producer looks at them and he's like, so you just faked that on the TV? And they're like, yeah, it's hilarious. And they're like, no one's going to get that, right? Like, why would anybody know the vertical hold broke? They would go into their TVs and they're like, yeah. Right? Right, and the irony can do that too, right? Like maybe it's just a joke for you. That's particularly true when you're talking about people who aren't as savvy in the medium. I think a lot about this with fields I understand, like poetry, which very much speak to themselves, and fields I don't understand, like modern dance, which very much speak to themselves. And I find myself like chuckling along with poetry sometimes in ways that I know 99% of the readers of this stuff don't know. And then I watch modern dance as the 99% just staring at people moving and wondering what the hell's happening. Because there's a conversation going on that I don't know. And I mean, I don't mean irony necessarily in a parodic way, but that idea that there's a relationship to other work, that a piece of work is a comment on another piece of work. I think about something like Seibel from that perspective a little bit, right? Like is Freeman deliberately putting this kind of gameplay in here because she wants to comment on how vapid the gameplay is? But did you have to play Phantasy Star Online to even recognize that? If I never played Phantasy Star Online, would I even know that that's what's going on? And then there's a final viewpoint, which I want to talk about briefly, but I want to kind of dismiss because I hate it, and I want to just get it out of the way right away, which is like the idea of outsider art. That somehow we're going to take this ironic position, but we're going to somehow claim that like people just didn't know. That like the reason why this happened is because designers didn't know what they were doing. Right? And in games, this usually manifests as they weren't a game designer. They made a game that they weren't a game designer, right? And like I find that hyper problematic. This is Darger because like I guess I'm talking about outsider art, so I have to show Darger at some point, right? And then this idea of like what does that mean when we say that? Right? And if you look at the terminology around this, it's problematic. It's like naive art and primitivism and all these terms that sort of imply that someone doesn't understand something they were supposed to have understood. And what I find problematic about this is when I look at work like this, you're sort of telling me as a framing device that this person is inferior to the discipline. And yet they made this work, right? It's like we're going to look at this work under the cloud of understanding that they didn't really understand what they were doing. They didn't understand like technically what perspective was, but yet they made this, right? That's just problematic to say that at all. To me, like I find the aesthetic valuation of that really problematic, but it's also really fuzzy, right? This is Laura Owens. This is at the Whitney right now. What is the difference between this and this? Like aesthetically, that's making this a museum piece and this not? Is Laura Owens an outsider artist? I don't even know. Like I don't know what that means. Like I feel like when we make that claim, we're sort of putting a frame around a piece of work based on a discipline's expectations that then deliberately make the work inferior and then ask to praise it. It's as if you showed someone a painting and said, my 5-year-old made it, isn't it great? Right? So you sort of like lowered my expectations so you could bring them back up. And it's like I could also just look at it. Right? Without any of that framing and kind of give you an answer. And I feel like there's something there that's really important. This matters to me a lot because games get this all the time. Right? And that Dragon Cancer largely was taught, and I can talk about Dragon Cancer as much as I want because I consulted on that thing. So like my fingerprints are on it. Like it got this all the time. It's like beautiful game, really interesting graphic style, really wonderful script and voice acting, like really incredible. The narrative is this beautiful meditation on faith that's not about lack of faith, but about different kinds of faith. Like really gorgeous. The gameplay is atrociously bad. Like incomprehensible, doesn't communicate what they want to communicate, just flat out fails at places, which I would argue contributed to its commercial failure. But when people talked about it that way, it was always under the frame of like, well, the Greens never made a game before. As if somehow that was like an okay thing to say. Like that was all right. well, yeah, it kind of sucked, but they don't know what they're doing. Look how great it is, despite the fact they don't know what they're doing. And to me, that smacks of so much elitism, I want to vomit. Right? Cart Life got this too. Right? And to Hoffmeyer's credit, at least in my opinion, he got up on stage with me when I critiqued his game, and he would have a conversation with me about it. Right? Because I didn't want to give him an out that he wasn't a game designer. He made a game. Let's talk about your game as a game. Right? And he was there with me on it, which was cool. Maybe that's my elitism of expecting people to engage in my discourse. But that's kind of where I end up on this, is that like I kind of see these three lenses on anti-design. I see three ways of understanding anti-design that make sense to me. One is to say that really we're seeing another aesthetic here. And yes, it's not the commercial aesthetic. It's a different aesthetic. But it has a truth to itself that defends its anti-design principles. Right? An aesthetic truth or a cultural truth that is part of our consumption of the work. Or I could say this work is in commentary with design practice. Like it itself engages in the conversation of design practice by defying design practice. So if it's anti-design on purpose. It's trying to defy design. And so that's how we should evaluate it. We can laugh at how bad the driving is in a game because we know what driving should be like and we recognize the developers deliberately made choices against that. And that's funny because we know what that should be. Or we could claim that it's the work of people who don't understand games. And that we have to give it a pass because they don't really know what they're doing. And again, keep in mind, like I'm not talking about all indie games again. There are indie games that are very, like this is Pop the Lock by Simple Machine, super hyper commercial game. Right? And Kurt Beag's philosophy about game design is to make hyper commercial approachable games. Like that's what he wants to do. So like you can be indie and not do that, obviously. You can be indie and defy these things. This is Dysphoria on the right. Right? Yeah, right. Left. Stage right. Audience right, stage left. Like Dysphoria, which is like defies a lot of expectations of games, but ties it together into an aesthetic that almost everybody recognizes. And then we get into this ineffable space of like, what does it mean for things to be art? But like, I want to kind of leave that alone. I'm talking about things that are deliberately pushing against the boundaries of things we understand from what we understand as game design as being broken. And we recognize them as broken. And that's why this becomes problematic to me. And that's kind of where I'm going to leave it, because I don't have an answer to this. I'm just thinking about it. If we talk about outsider art, that's elitism. Right? Because we're classifying art as something and saying that someone's not in it and then evaluating them against those standards. There's no way I can understand that other than by putting myself in a privileged position and saying that like, oh, these lucky few who got in here even though they didn't go through the rigor that we understand. That is so beautiful that they made that stuff. Someday they might be real artists, right? Like I can't accept that argument as a valid place to come from. But isn't irony a bit elitist? Because like, don't you already have to understand the form for it to make any sense? If I make a game that's supposed to be ironic and you show it to an audience that doesn't know all that history of games, what is it? It's missed. Right? If you make a joke about agency to an audience that's never thought about agency, they're not going to understand that that's there. They might perceive it as real, just like I may turn the vertical hold on my TV when the vertical hold slips. But is authenticity elitist, right? Because is all I'm saying that like my taste is better than everybody else's and that people just don't appreciate my taste. I'm just forcing, rather than trying to meet you halfway, I'm just going to force you to accept that like something that you recognize as inferior singing and bad production quality and limited chords is actually good music. Not like your auto-tuned crap, which you've never actually thought in your life. And so you just end up getting alienated from it. And that's really, I don't know, it's just really fascinating to me because like it becomes this question of like, well, what are we doing when we curate anti-design work? How do we curate anti-design work? How do we show anti-design work? How do we talk about anti-design work? Because this won an award as best game. So we presented it that way. And I know from my experience, at least talking to people in film and other like new media forms, when they played it, they didn't understand what it was. Like they didn't understand how we gave this an award. Because they were like, it was boring. It was really, really boring. Aren't games supposed to be fun? And I wrestle internally with like how we're supposed to respond to that question as people who are critics and curators of games. Like what should we say? Like, how do we understand what Cart Life is relative to our medium if it's something that we want to showcase? And I think we should showcase Cart Life because Cart Life is really interesting and very powerful in particular places. But, like, what is the lens, the aesthetic lens we're going to take on that? And what does that mean for how we curate and show work? Like as a teacher, I think about this all the time in terms of what I encourage students to do. Do I encourage students to make expressions that are anti-design? And how do I encourage them to do it? And how do I encourage them to talk about it? I don't know. Yeah, so like I said, this is like, so that was all my cards. So so now I'm going to show my thank you slide that I always end on, even though I'm not really thanking you for anything because I didn't really tell you anything. So what I'm hoping is, like, at this point, you know, with like a half an hour left of this thing, we could just talk about that. And like I said, that if you were like, boy, that was bullshit, you can like pick up a local rock and throw it at the right part of the argument. Cool.
Yeah, so you kind of started and ended with this idea of like, aren't games supposed to be fun? And one of your slides was drudgery does not equal fun. And I think that slide is objectively true, but also it's weird that games are the only medium where we're like, there's one good vector, fun. And we don't do that with other art at all. Like a movie can be fun, but a movie definitely doesn't have to be fun to be good. And so Car Life I actually think is a really interesting example because I agree with most of what you said about Car Life, and we've like discussed this before.
Yeah.
But your example of like, oh, the typing or the math is really bad, I very much don't agree with because I think it serves a really specific purpose, and that purpose isn't fun, and it also I think is not boredom. It's that you are heavily penalized for messing up. So it's a task that like encourages you to zone out and not pay attention, and then just thrashes you when you do. And that creates a really interesting tension. Like, I'm not bored doing that. I'm actually stressed. And, like, that's a type of engagement. And I feel like it's working well there. Now, the map scene, like, with the buses, yes, that's terrible. There's a lot of menus in that game that are really inscrutable and don't serve a purpose. But I think the idea of that drudgery not being about being boring, but about being, like, requiring your attention for something you don't really want to give attention to, and then really snapping you back when you mess up works really well in that game.
Okay. How do you want to do this? You want to bounce the ball around a little bit? Because I don't want this to be centered on me. Yeah.
I've sort of just entered the game design recently, but I find it was really interesting that you mentioned outsider work and what's the difference between, you know, the piece in the museum that was praised as the professional or high-level art versus someone who just made art and looked the same that way. But I think you also mentioned that something that's very different between those is the purpose. So why is that artist making that art deliberately like that? What's the purpose and what is the expression that artists want to do? That's something I think that says a difference between the two type of art. As a beginner or as someone who didn't quite know what they're doing, maybe they did it that way because the limitation of the skill, not because the purpose of what kind of expression that person is trying to make. And that brings back to the game design. What is the purpose, the type of game you're trying to make, what kind of audience you're trying to reach, what kind of story you're trying to tell. The card life you mentioned, I thought was interesting because you said it went a word, but the game itself was boring and it was not fun.
That's a contested point right now.
I was also interested to know who gave the award, who was the one who made this decision that the game should win.
The IGF at the GDC.
So that person, that was a team?
Was that Brandon at the time? Do you know?
No, he was still the head.
Yeah. So it was a jury that decided that at the Game Developers Conference.
And they're game designers?
And developers, yes.
Okay. So as someone who knows the game, who knows the design, and they are the insiders, so they understand the aesthetic and the concept. So maybe they saw something that, as an outsider who didn't understand game that much, they understand a little more. But I'm not sure. That's interesting to think about. What's your target audience? Who do you want to bring?
Yeah, that's what I think when I hear that. Right? I want to respond to you. I just don't want to cut anybody off. I think that it's a question, right? Like, that's what I'm kind of questioning here. And like some of the decisions Indiecade makes about why they award things they award. You give a technology award to a tabletop role-playing game. Like, what does that mean? You give a game design award to a theater piece. What does that mean? Like, what are you doing when you do that? Not like, what are you doing? But like what are you doing? Like, what form does that have? Like, what does that do? I mean, on the cart life points, fun I use very broadly, very, very broadly. From an aesthetic perspective, I'm sort of talking about beauty from an aesthetic perspective. So yeah, if and I know it's confusing, so that's my fault. Like, if we talk about fun from this limited perspective of sort of like what we think we get from toys, that's not really what I mean. I mean, we could use a broader word. I don't like using that word on principle because I think it's a much bigger argument about like what that does to design practice when you start using words like engaging in games. I think is very dangerous in educational settings because then people start thinking that like somehow Dragon Box is different than Mario, and that's a very, very bad thing for people to think. You got to keep them from doing that. You don't want to make your documentaries just only watching documentaries. It's like a dangerous. You're missing out on all these other things that were filmed that are really interesting. But yeah, on the drudgery point, I mean, I think that. See, I don't know that my opinion changes when I think about it that way because it's a painful experience, and I found it boring after a couple of beats because I disassociated from it. Right? I think what happened was it was painful a couple of times, and then I realized it wasn't that. I could do it well enough that it wasn't that critical and that I didn't want to stay in that space. And so I just sort of disconnected. And then it just became like I'm just typing on a keyboard over and over again. But to me, the question kind of is, well, like, what can art do to avoid that thing, right? Like, there are lots of movies that show boring things in them, right? And they find a way to communicate a boring thing in a way that makes me still want to watch the movie. And that's like this really interesting question to me of like, okay, well, other forms do this. When I talked about Cart Life, I talked about this play Wit, which is a play about English professor, like an expert on Dunn, who gets terminal cancer, and the whole play takes place in the hospital as she's dying. And it's all about her interactions with the hospital. And it's a brilliant play. It won a bunch of awards, and it was very highly regarded when it came out. It came out about 20 years ago. But it's a play about a very powerful woman being crippled by a disease and having all of these doctors. I mean, it was a real brilliant gesture in the story. All of these doctors treating her like she doesn't know anything, when effectively for her whole life she's been an expert. And it's about the humiliation and the sort of helplessness she suffers as she like realizes that all this expertise she spent all her life building and all this reputation she's built at this moment of biological failure fails her. And now she must be in a helpless position. And it's about her kind of coming to terms with the reality of that. It's a really painful story, right? And depressing. But I was entertained. I watched it. I was entertained by it. And like that's a trick that art does. I think that's actually a really powerful trick that art does. So when I see things that hurt me by hitting me in the head with a hammer, like I'm sort of like, well, couldn't you do this in a way that actually keeps me here? And I would still feel that sense of pain or that sense of boredom. And that's where I think that the mechanics of Cart Life fail. But that's an arguable point, right? Like I totally hear your argument about it. I just wonder like what kind of rarefied sense does it require to be able to go through that kind of suffering and accept it, and is that something that we can imagine a normal commercial audience, like a more general commercial audience accepting?
I have a question. So the irony and the authenticity I sometimes see is like a bit related. Like I generally feel, and knowing I think the story of Richard and some of the work that he's done, like putting the stuff in the pizza place,
Mm-hmm.
right? And, like I feel like he makes a wholehearted attempt to almost tell a story or to connect with people. And I was wondering, in the conversation that you had with him, if maybe some of the uncomfortableness from the game is his, attempt, not even being ironic, but trying to really tell the story through the mechanics, and then the authenticity maybe being the lack of tools, or, I don't see it also as being exclusive sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Because maybe it's exclusive, like you can come into Baby Castles and be like, this place is a mess, I'm never coming back. Or maybe you could come in here and be like, oh wow, if they can do it, and this is like a place, then I guess anybody So maybe, the authenticity is just like using what you have and putting it out there into the world and not being too precious about the materials. Like, when you had that conversation with him, did he expand on that?
Well, his attitude was like from what this is very secondhand, right? This is just basically what I talked to him about on stage. His attitude was that he was coming at it from a literary perspective. He actually, it was interesting because he really resonated with what I was talking about, because he was like, yeah, that was my intent, was to tell stories. Like, that's what I wanted to do. And I really wanted to get to the heart of these things, because I thought game stories were really stupid. And I had these very powerful, these ideas of storytelling. And before he kind of stopped doing this kind of work, he was really engaged with thinking about storytelling at that level. And the mechanics were something he was sort of trying, but his way of saying it was that he was very open to the criticism on them, because he's like, I didn't quite know what I was doing, so I was trying to make this work. And to me, I feel like my job as a critic is to point that out. Right? It's to say, okay, well, that didn't work. We'll take something safe in the room, right? The map does not work. It really doesn't work. So, saying that, it doesn't work because you can't have me go to a screen where I'm looking for objectives and not put the objectives on the screen, because then I don't know what to do with it, right? And that's a basic just-in-time information interaction design thing. Of course, to be honest, when I say, even that coming out of my mouth is kind of elitist, right? That's a basic interaction design thing that's kind of obvious. Well, why? Right? That's a cultural aspect of how I learned to create games and the games I play. I think about this a lot when it comes to experiences like Twine, right? Like these sort of a lot of these Twine experiences. I feel like there's a level of these Twine experiences that have largely Porpentine, right? Where everyone's just yep, that is good, right? And it's gotten kind of sliced off the top of Twine, and everybody you can put it in the MoMA and it's all, or the Whitney, and it's all cool. There's a bunch of other Twine stuff there too. Twine stuff that people in the parser space, which is if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the interactive fiction space, the people who are doing the old Infocom game stuff. They are just that stuff is terrible and they won't accept it, right? But people within that Twine community are celebrating their own work and pushing things up and kind of pointing out other creators. And so it becomes a question of well, when do those tropes become strong enough that there's a culture around them, and now that's an aesthetic, but it's an aesthetic that's not reaching a lot of people outside of it, because no one's been trained to understand what they're looking at and what's good. So I feel I think there's a really interesting question around that idea of authentic, in the sense of I didn't know how to do this, or I didn't know what I was going for, because I don't want to presume that means it's not good, right? People can I don't believe in distinguishing between art that was trained in an institution according to certain parameters and art that wasn't. I don't think that's a useful distinction. I think we can look at work and just evaluate it. But I think we carry the baggage of those institutions with us when we do. So I think there's a question to me of well, if I want to show work that I can look at, if I can look at Cart Life as a game designer and be this is interesting for this reason, I think that I need to somehow explain that to someone for whom a game is Mario Party. Right? If I want them to play it. Because if I just show it to them, they're going to be I'm getting hit with barbed wire over and over again. This is not interesting, and they back away. Right? I think Problematic. I love Problematic. I think Problematic is an amazing artistic expression, but wow, that's modern dance for modern dancers. Nobody outside of that's going to make any sense of that thing. It's just going to be super frustrating. You move and then suddenly the screen changes and you just don't know what the hell happened. That's parsing that is next to impossible. And I just wonder okay, well, what do we want to do when we curate work like that? How do we want to talk about it? How do we want to introduce people to the work like that? And how do we get people to understand those aesthetics? And I don't, maybe people know this, but I don't know how this is handled in other fields, because my only background is in music other than games, and punk did not give a shit about you caring about our music. It was a badge of honor that you listen to that music, right? And so if you wanted to get in the door, you had to kind of accept that yeah, sure, some of these people don't play guitar as well as some other people, but if that's what you're concerned about, fuck you, right? That's punk. That's what punk literally was, right? And yeah, I have a safety pin in my ear. Fuck you if you don't like it, right? Because if you do like it, then you're sort of here with me, and then that's cool, right? Because that was the whole point, was to sort of build a community around that, and maybe that's the point. Right, is to make weird little expressions and build a community around weird little expressions. But we should just recognize if that's what we're going to do, never going to get outside of there. unless we make a Green Day where like someone like kind of like bridges that gap, right, and brings that sensibility out.
Yeah, maybe a second generation, or a lot of times a subculture will. The whole point of it is to get away from like another culture. Like they want to be weird, they want to be different, just for the sake of getting away from maybe a mainstream thing. And then a generation later, like once all the tropes are settled down, then someone says, "Hey, this is how we make a really great, like build a mainstream game using all these tropes on top of it." And then they bring it over to the mainstream. And then a new group hates that thing,
right, and throws it out.
They have to go.
But so do you feel like that's where that? I mean, because like I think there is a class of indie games that's like people making like Thumper or something, right? Which is like you know, I'm not knocking Thumper. I like Thumper, right? But Thumper is very much like I'm making a game like a game for gamers. It makes sense, right? There's like some interesting kind of choices in it, but it's not Liz Fearson's work, right? It's not like deliberately kind of like stomping into a new territory or tearing down barriers. Do you see that work in that space of like a kind of first generation, like we're going to defy and like try to create anew, and we're forming an understanding now?
I think with Thumper, they were just like, well, we made Guitar Hero because I think it was like two guys,
yeah,
the harmonics guys. So they were just like, we know how to make a great Guitar Hero game. It would be great if we could explore some music that's not really approached normally in a Guitar Hero setting. So I think they're more interested in exploring different musical spaces. But I guess their game was more indie. I don't know if it was ironic or punk. It was more like a horror thing.
Yeah.
I don't know that maybe, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's tons of indie. I mean, this is what I think about. There's like tons of indie movies. Like you go to something like Sundance and you watch a bunch of indie movies, and there's tons of them that just like want to be Get Out, or want to be like I mean, Get Out wants to be Halloween, right? Like it's a very, very direct line there, and that's cool, right? Get Out's amazing, and like it's amazing in part because it's Halloween, because it realized like, oh, I could take this thriller and put race into it, and it goes. So it's not trying to be indie the way something like, I don't know, Tree of Life is like, or like Twin Peaks: The Return. It's like, okay, here's our crazy 4 minutes of color with nothing else happening, and now we're going to do a silent movie for 30 minutes in the middle of this thing. It's like that's pushing boundaries in a very different way. So I mean, I totally hear you about that, right? Like there's a lot of work that's being done that's not pushing on these boundaries at all, and that's interesting, and that's fascinating, and really good work's coming out of that, like great work's coming out of that. I'm curious about the work that's not doing that. I'm curious about the work that's like, I like deliberately basically saying I'm gonna tear down this edifice to make something new. And what you said was kind of interesting to me. Is that part of a subcultural reaction? That's just basically like, we don't want to make things like that, so we're just going to make other things, and it takes a little while for that to incubate before that becomes like.
I think it's also one of the only ways to find success or find an audience is to like be different than what's currently going on. Because like even with the Get Out, like okay, so Get Out gets all these awards, and now that's like, you can't just make Get Out 2 or like a copy of Get Out. You have to do something different or unique to actually get the critics to look at you or get the audiences to look at you. So because it's just so saturated, like if Get Out's a success, they'll just throw a lot of money behind like Get Out 2 or something like it. And if you don't have those resources, you have to do something just completely different.
I feel like
So I
in the
think-
game industry that they would try to make, if they Get Out 2, Get Out 3.
Yeah, and the people like funding their movies right now, that's probably like, this worked. How do we tweak it a little bit and kind of use the format? But if you're indie or like just small enough, you can't do that strategy, so you have to come up with something different. So I think that's why a lot of people either try to destroy the mainstream or just sort of subversive into looking for unique stuff.
Go.
I guess I'm wondering why do you start the talk saying like anti-design? You know what I mean? Like why does it have to be an anti thing? Why isn't it? It seems like you have these three categories of authenticity, which you kind of describe as like a purposeful oh, I want to be like this thing. Which really, that like the way you describe authenticity that's not really authentic, right? You know, like being purposely like something is actually not like an authentic representation. And then like,
Oh, neat. Can we have that fight? Let's do that. This is great.
but like with irony and outsider art, if those are the three categories, doing something in order to just express, like, you know, their own ideas. Like, why it seems like all of these things are kind of brought upon this like value judgment of, and it's not it's not necessarily like why does it have to do with like, oh, what is like the commercial need, or what is necessarily popular, because there are plenty of things that just kind of do something to do it and people will see it, and you know, often those things become commercial or whatever, but that's just because of the form. Do you understand?
Oh yeah. I want to let other people talk, but I want to respond to one thing you said because this is very important about what I'm saying. Though these words that I'm using, I turned this off. These words that I'm using have nothing to do with what the creator actually thought they were doing. Like nothing. I don't, and frankly, I don't. As a critic, I don't genuinely care what the creator thought they were doing. These are audience response words. Like when I look at the work, what do I think that person was doing? Do I think that person was authentic to an aesthetic that they hold? Do I think that person was commenting on something that goes on? Do I think that person was ignorant of how these things work and just bumbled around like stupidly through the system and then made something beautiful anyway? Like, so I'm not trying to make a claim about why people create here at all. I'm making a claim about how audiences perceive what the purpose of a thing is. And authenticity to me, as someone who followed punk but did not know anything about punk musicians and I think that makes me, and I'm this is something we could really debate, but I'm going to argue this very, very strongly because I believe this is true. As a consumer, I knew nothing about the biographies, work production processes, or intentions of the artists that I saw. And I think most consumers know nothing about those things. I think they consume work. Right? And so as someone who consumed work and didn't know any of those things, I looked at a band like Fugazi and I said, why does Fugazi do what it does? Like, why do they deliberately keep their CD prices low? Why do they deliberately keep their concert prices low? Why do they make music that has this kind of sound to it about these topics? And I said, this is an expression of an aesthetic. They are expressing an aesthetic that is their aesthetic. And I interpreted that, and this is the language we use. I mean, again, I'm using the language I knew from my punk scene, which was like the New York people who wanted to be in California punk scene, which is like, or DC, I guess. I guess I should have hoped to be in DC. Was authentic. That was the literal word we used. So that's why I'm pulling it out. It's because like that word is meaningful to me that way, but it's not to say that I thought those artists were producing to try to appear authentic or that they were authentic, or I don't even know. Like I have no idea like what any of those bands were doing. I just know that like I looked at them and said, oh, this is how they believe the work should be made. And I judged them that way. And that was how I understood my relationship to that work. As opposed to say, work that I don't take seriously, but that I appreciate because it's like, oh, I see what you're doing is you're making fun of movies or you're making fun of music or you're making fun of games. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I understand that, but like for instance, like what is the authenticity of Fugazi? It's not like necessarily, I mean, I would argue that Fugazi isn't trying to express an aesthetic. Their aesthetic is created from, their just personal philosophy of, they want to have like these, all age shows, they want to encourage, it's like, oh, anybody can kind of make this music and it's like a communal thing. So I feel like the aesthetic is arrived through their form.
Yeah.
Right? And it's like a lot of the games in the community that I participate in, like in Glorious Trainwrecks or something like that, those people are kind of, for the most part, a lot of those people are just doing the same thing, and it's more of like a philosophical thing that is creating the aesthetic rather than the aesthetic creating, just for itself. It's not aesthetic for itself oftentimes, and that's often why people would criticize something like Green Day is because it's, it's like an
Oh, great! I should have known if I started talking about punk and then brought up Green Day, we were going to have this fight. I would love to respond to you, but I want to let other people talk. I saw a couple other hands up, so I want to make sure other people get to speak. Yeah.
It was really interesting when you're talking about whether the game was made to express one person's aesthetics, like just make it as close to understand or she understand about the topic the game is expressing, or the game is actually made to reach some people and allows people to understand it. I think it's very interesting because game is considered an art form, but also considered a medium. You can reach certain audiences, but you're also expressing yourself, and what makes it different is because you have a unique aesthetic to make the art, make the game piece. I found this might not be a very common thing for other medium. Like, I came from a background of doing journalism, and being creative, it's pretty much limited. I think most of the journalism have pretty a mature structure, how you can the best reach your audiences and let them understand. So if you are introducing a new topic, a new book, you have to have half of the sentence or a sentence to explain what you're talking about, so next person can get what this reference is made to connect all the thoughts and points in the journalism piece. But games sometimes is in this very, like, in the middle of being an art and also a medium kind of position. So I guess that's why we have this discussion about whether you should be actually having this sort of reaching some people and reaching the audience in your mind when you're making the piece, or you just solely expressing yourself.
Well, yeah, I mean, I would argue that journalism, it would be impossible. The statement I'm about to make is impossible to say in journalism. I am very interested in this story, and I don't care if anybody else cares. I'm just going to make the story the way I want to. That is nonsensical in journalism. Like, you could not, you can't make, it just doesn't make any sense. It's like, no, the journalism is about communicating. Like, it's like, if I'm not communicating to somebody, I didn't make anything. I just researched something for myself, I guess. Right? So
the purpose is to explain it to
yeah.
other people.
So
whether they can understand.
art's uncomfortable that way, right? Because part of art is like, I'm expressing myself, right? And there's a kind of mythology about art in the Western world, which is very much like the purpose of art is to be an act of self-expression. And I don't say that to be false. I mean, it's just like a dominant mythology. That's true for a lot of people. But there's another function of art, which is to like be in a gallery, right? And if art is in a gallery, it means other people are seeing it, right? And to deny that is to deny reality, right? It's like your work is appearing before other people. So the question then is, like, as an artist, like, do you care about that? I'm a commercial artist, so my attitude is yes. Yes, you do care about that. You should. People are going to consume your work. Like, you could make your work and then, like, do the Emily Dickinson thing, like tie it in a red ribbon and throw it in your attic, right? And then millions and millions of people who do that never get discovered, and one of them we know, and that's why we know Emily Dickinson, is because somebody saw that stuff. What actually happened is she sent some stuff to a publisher, and like the publisher rejected it, and she kind of just got defeated, and then she just buried it all in her house. But people knew it was there, so when she died, they dug it back out, and they were like, "Holy shit, this stuff is amazing!" And they put it out, right? So if you want to talk about outsider artists, like almost, it's like I can't think of a better example of that. But that's really weird, right? And really lucky, because like I'm telling you, there's millions of people who've done that, who never got discovered.
Do you really think there's like 10 Emily Dickinsons that weren't discovered, like that their work was lost? Because if it is, it's a tragedy that people weren't able to see the stuff. But I feel like for the most part, stuff gets found. I don't know.
Well, when you look at the cycle of literature, it's fascinating. This is way off. Oh, I guess it's not off topic. It's really interesting. Like, so when you study, so there's a book called Literary Criticism by Terry Eagleton, which is great for this, about like how taste changes. And what he talks about Shakespeare and like what people are interested in Shakespeare. So Shakespeare starts writing in the like early Renaissance, and like when he's writing, he's actually successful right away. Right? People like his plays. He also writes these sonnets, and nobody pays any attention to them at all. And then they get kind of discovered after he dies, and people are like, "Oh, these sonnets are pretty good," and they pay attention to them for a little while, and some of the plays drop away. And then around like, and I'm gonna get my dates not perfect here because I didn't research this, but it's like somewhere in the 19th century, people make this switch. And they basically say Shakespeare's sonnets are terrible, and they stop reading them altogether. They just pablum, like sappy nonsense, and they just read the plays. And we don't rediscover Shakespeare's sonnets until the 20th century, when people start getting interested in them again. For most of the history of reading Chaucer, right, from the time Chaucer lived, people read a book called Troilus and Cressida. Have any of you ever heard of that book before? And this is like hundreds of years, because the Canterbury Tales, which you probably have heard of if you know anything about Chaucer, were unfinished and people thought it was an incomplete work. And no one really looked at it. And then sometime around the 19th century, people were like, wow, this Canterbury Tales is really amazing. And then they switched and nobody reads Troilus and Cressida anymore. And Troilus and Cressida is amazing. Like, amazing. It has one of the most beautiful single monologues I have ever read in an English literature of any form. Like, it's incredible, but it's just gone. So do I think Emily Dickinson's were lost? Yes. Absolutely yes. And do I think it's sad? Absolutely yes. And I hope we rediscover some of that stuff. There was actually just an article in Times about like an author named, I think, Wheeler, who was like writing at the same time as Baldwin, and like people are like, why does nobody know this person? You can like go look up Dos Passos, who was writing the America trilogy at the same time as Hemingway and Fitzgerald, and it's brilliant, but it happens to be a little bit communist. And so it's shut down and it disappeared from American literature for like 60 years. So I do think that kind of stuff happens. It's why this question really interests me. I'm sorry to riff on this so hard, but like this is what's interesting to me about this question is that like we do lose work, right? Work does get forgotten, or we just have the wrong aesthetic valuations for some time. Like wrong meaning we don't appreciate what it is for what it is, and then we let it slide. And I'm like, and I get concerned that if we and I mean, anti-design, I hear you about that phrase being kind of problematic. I guess I was trying to be charged. I'm going to keep using it, but I hear you, right? We'll think of a better term later. But like if we have like anti-design work that's really interesting, but we don't have a way for people to consume it, will it get lost? Yeah.
I have a way to. I'm thinking about tying this back into, because one of the statements that you had is like, as curators, how do we talk about this? And I'm opening this up to people who are curators in their own life too, like the games that you choose to play or that you choose to talk about and share with your friends. I think that, and this might be personally important to me, that the role of education and providing a larger context about the work, why it's important, why it's different, why anti-design is interesting, is the responsibility of the people who curate or the people who share things to do that, to be the educators. I think it's extra work, but I think it's very important. And just even listening to you talk about, you know, Emily Dickinson and like all this other stuff that was happening at the time, I think it also provides insight around the culture at the time, which is important. So anyway.
I just want to add on that. I was thinking about, you know, connect with the audience. Is that the role for an artist or for a curator? I think as a curator, you kind of try to put the context and try to connect the artist with audience. And I think that's more of a job for curators, instead of trying to change your work as an artist to connect yourself with your audience. I've seen some practice to curate new media art. Most recent example is the one exhibition in the Museum of Art and Design. There's an exhibition about electronic music, and the way the curator did the exhibition is to break down every single element and put the music people can engage in easily by listening to the music, and they simplify the music production process by make you doing some really simple things, and people go there with no knowledge, they can engage with the piece easily. So I think it's not as much of the job for an artist itself to do your work differently, but it's how to connect the work with audience, how to provide context to people who doesn't have knowledge about the game.
I think a lot of I think it's like understanding these like higher level concepts like irony or authenticity related to video games. It has a lot. Like how much how literate the player is about games in general, like how exposed they are to different concepts. So like imagine a world where like your elementary school, there's a class called gaming literacy where you just sit there and play games and learn about all these different games.
Yeah.
And then you have the entire like U.S. population that's had this class. Like instead of everyone playing Candy Crush, they're playing like something just way more advanced because they understand all of these concepts. So I think it is the job of the critics to educate and some of the more elite academic institutions that is their job to spread the knowledge so we can create not more advanced works, but we can enjoy more subtle things like irony, or we can get the joke when the TV's like fuzzy that that guy punked me.
This is the conversation. This is exactly the conversation I want to have. Like, I think this is like the kind of thing I'm really, because as a teacher, I'm interested in this, right? Like, I'm interested in like what it means to teach this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's important to create setups where you can educate people, but also at a certain point, like it is good to have work that comments very specifically on the medium. And like you said with modern dance, chances are there's no amount of education that's going to get you in the loop on that, because you at the end of the day just aren't that personally interested in modern dance. And I think things like Problematic, it's fine. It's like that is not a game that most people are ever going to have fun with, and like that's actually okay, because that game wasn't particularly made with that like a general audience in mind, and there's like a scope of work. I think Spelunky might be the best game ever made, but it's certainly not going to be the first platformer I give someone.
Right? Yeah.
It's not going to be good. They're not going to see the strengths of that work if they've never played Mario. And that's okay. So it means there's automatically an audience that will just never be able to appreciate Spelunky because there's other things they need to do first, and if they haven't shown the interest to do that, they won't. But there's still a lot of people who are going to love Spelunky and really love it because of how deeply it explores those mechanics.
Right, so does indie game become punk? Right? That's ultimately what I'm thinking about when I talk about this talk. And I'm not saying indie game is punk, because I know that's a controversial thing to say. But, like, does it become punk in the sense that, like, it becomes like that like, there's a cultural knowledge at a certain, and maybe that we already are this, right? There's a cultural knowledge that a certain number of people have that you said Spelunky in this room without explaining it and just assumed everybody in this room knew what you were talking about, right? Just like I did on purpose during this talk, like, named a bunch of games without explaining them, because I assumed everybody in this room knew what I was talking about. And I hope that I get to this point in this talk where I'm like, yeah, we're all kind of inside, right? and maybe that's okay, that we're all going to be kind of inside, and there'll be this community of people. If that's the case, then I think personally, and I'm not blaming anybody in this room, I think everybody's fighting the fight in this room, but I think when we look at the world at large, we need to do more to make that real. Like, we have to really build that community out, because I think that that's going to be what saves us commercially.
But you're also saying indie games like it relates to one group. And
no, of course not. Of course not.
That's almost like saying like indie music. Like punk is indie music, I guess. Like, but there's so many things that would use the label indie music, and I think it's really tricky to talk about indie games that way, because you get such a range of people who are like, oh yeah, definitely indie games. That's me.
But can you genre define those for me very well? I can do a couple. I could talk about esports probably as a genre. But, like, I don't, and maybe walking simulators.
Trainwrecks is definitely, like, a genre. I mean, it's also, like, a title of things. But, like, you know what I'm talking about when I talk about a glorious Trainwreck game. And that's, like, such a small microcosm of what might be called indie games.
Yeah, but, I mean, maybe that's part of it, too, right? Is that we actually need to define those things more, right? Because one of the arguments I've often made in class when people talk about games and criticism is that, like, one of the problems I see with the way we approach games is that we talk about gamers as though that were a thing. We don't talk about movie watchers, right? Everyone is a movie watcher, right? We talk about types of movies. Like, maybe you watch horror movies, or maybe you watch foreign films, or you watch independent productions. That means like Sundancey kind of things, because that's also a stupid phrase. But like, we kind of know what it means already. Or you watch like certain kinds of documentaries, and like you define yourself that way. And we have an understanding, largely because of media, right? Because of New Wave's film criticism, that we like actually understand how to talk about ourselves as consumers of movies. We don't really have that for games yet. And I think maybe that's what it is articulating like what punk actually is, as defined from like indie hip hop of different scenes, as defined differently from swing, right? All of which are subcultures you could talk about that have different behavior patterns, different music, different consumption patterns, different styles of dress, different associations. You know, and it's blowing that up. and then saying like, okay, but then creating communities around each one that could then become commercially viable. Because I'm not going to let that part go, and that's like where I'm going to like really push back hard. Is that like I want artists to eat. I really, because I'm an artist and I like eating, and also because I want I want lots of people I taught to eat and lots of people I know who are friends to eat. So like I don't want to let go of that idea. And if people want to make work, and I mean this very, very seriously, if you want to make work that no one's ever going to appreciate but you and your cousin, awesome, that's cool. That's not what I'm talking about. That's great. You can do that. And you don't need me to tell you to do that or any institutional structure to tell you to do that. That's not, I think, what we should be concerned about. Like, I think what we as an institutional structure should be concerned about is, like, how does this work reach people? Who are their audiences? How do those audiences grow in a way that makes this sustainable as an ecosystem, right? Not just commercially sustainable, but, like, culturally sustainable. Like, that's what's important to me. So if the game is really just meant to stay inside that circle, then it's about building that circle. If the game is meant to get out of that circle, it's how does it get out of that circle? And if you don't care about those two things, awesome. Tie them in red ribbon. Put them in your attic. Feel satisfied that you are an artist. You know, and you've accomplished all you wanted to do. And nothing anybody says in this room is going to matter to you. You already did it. But I think that, like, there is, to me, I do see this kind of this expression of crisis, and we were talking about this when people walked in, is like how does a broader cultural world view this work? What do they understand about this work, and how do they appreciate it? Because dance performances get grants, right? And the reason why we have them is because people pay money for them to go on, right? And that's a world we should be in, and hopefully we will be. And we.
I don't think we're having any problems producing indie games. Like, there's more games being produced than any point in human history. Like, it doesn't seem like it's slowing down. So I don't know if there's a crisis now. Getting paid to make the games is a different story.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
Writers have been having trouble getting paid to write stuff too. But production is a problem.
No, I don't think. I agree. Like, I think it's about consumption. That's why this talk is about consumption, because I think consumption is the problem. And other media have figured this out. Like other media have made this work. So I want us to make this work. And I don't know how, which is why I gave a random talk hoping that you would argue with me. Because I'm sort of like, this is the conversation I want our industry to have now. It's like, great, we've got a lot of producers. We're really smart at it. We've actually gotten really good, and there's a lot of really good people making it, and they're all going to burn out in like 5 years when they need jobs and they have kids. So how do we stop that from happening, right? So we can get to something that's like, and film is fucked up, but like, you make a film and it gets into Sundance and it gets bought and you have a career. That does not exist in our industry.
Well, so are you saying there should be like more larger organizations, like the government side, like giving grants for? Do you think the government should be giving grants for games?
Absolutely, yes.
They do it in Canada.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, they do it in Canada, by the way, in breathtaking ways. Like it's really horrifying if you go to Canada. I've sat in those juries. Hundreds of thousands of dollars of Canadian money, just like, I got this idea for a platformer, and it's like, here is your $250,000 Canadian.
So the only side effect of that, though, then you have the authenticity of like, well, who's inspiring or directing the work? You do have a small group of people who are deciding like there's a certain set of values I want to see in these games made that they consider authentic, and so now that small elite group of people is basically funding these projects instead of a more, I would say, more authentic thing, which is like finding an audience and that audience communicating with the work or engaging with the work.
Yeah, I mean, I got no problem with patronage. It got us all the Renaissance art. So, like, I think that if that works, that's great. If we get audiences to work, that's great. If channels functioned, if Steam wasn't, like Steam would stick to when it worked and stop fucking around, that'd be great, right? If, like, we had channels, like dedicated channels and things like app stores that, like, focus this work, that'd be great. And I'm not knocking the press, but if the press got the formula right, which it hasn't, and I mean this with utmost respect to all the people writing and critiquing games right now. I'm not trying to knock any of them, but like clearly this hasn't worked yet, right? It's just obvious from the world we live in. It hasn't quite penetrated yet. Like when we get that piece right, it's going to change the world. When somebody in journalism figures out how to become Ebert, right? And Roger Ebert, sorry, like old reference. Like Roger Ebert is like one of the most famous film critics in America. Like when we hit that, then the world will change, Because then someone will get, I'm gonna go very inside here, but just follow me. Then we'll get a television show that's watched by millions of people where both of the critics say should go see Dinner with Andre, which is like this tiny little independent film about two guys having dinner for an hour and a half to millions of people. And then suddenly people realize like, oh, I can go see an indie film that's just like a weird little conversation and it's going to be engaging to me. And even if they hate it, right, and they never watch it again because they're just not in that little authenticity circle, like they were exposed to it. So a whole audience of people who never even knew that thing existed could know that existed. Like that's what I'm concerned about. So like, yeah, I agree. It's not a concern about producing, right? People are going to produce, and we have the tools to produce have democratized so well that it's possible to produce. My concern is that I think there are much bigger audiences for all of these things. I think they exist in art, like in the art scenes, and those are the people who will play Cart Life, right? Because they will tolerate that kind of stuff. But also in the casual scenes of people who just don't know what Spelunky is, right? And how many people have been barricaded off by not knowing, WASD mouse from experiences they would have enjoyed for years, right? Like, I mean, I think that this is like been a problem of the game industry forever in a way. Or a problem that, no, not forever. A problem that came up because certain game developers in the late 80s decided to target men rather than women because of the realities of the toy industry, and then created a hyper-specialized class of people who played games that we're only now just getting out of, right? But now that we're getting out of it, we should rethink that, and we should say, like, okay, well, who are the audiences we're not reaching, and how do we reach them? And maybe this indie stuff, in the broad sense, these niches we're forming could reach broader audiences. Maybe there are people out there who would consume this stuff, because there are people who watch, like, McCarthy video art for 6 hours, right? So clearly those people can take suffering, right? So maybe we can find a way to like bring experiences to them. Now I'm gonna say one more thing about how much longer you want me to go here. I don't want to.
I also Todd had his hand up.
Oh sure. Sorry, I couldn't see you back there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was a small hand. Sorry, it's not directly.
And I know you wanted to say something in the back too. I'm not ignoring you. I swear.
I've just been looking at this slide for a while, and just like the outsider art line feels kind of out of place with the other two, and so like in the spirit of feedback, I feel like I'm totally with you on the like condescension of saying like, oh, someone's like an outsider art, but so like they made some mistakes or something's like not doing what it's trying to do, but that's okay. Like I think we can just like have like the spirit of the talk is like why when you have like a bad experience in a game or like an off-putting experience, a like non-optimized pop experience in a game, what are the different reasons for that? And it could be like Dwarf Fortress style, that it's trying to be authentic to a certain style of game. It could be like I think in Sybil the like commentary on M&O, on irony. For us, so it could just be like a mistake. It could just or a just like lack of competence in the medium, or it could be like like there's room for improvement here, and it was like non-deliberate. And then I think there's like a fourth part also, which is like designing for negative experiences, which is maybe that what like there's a difference here we're noting in Cart Life between the map and the math, where like the map isn't supposed to create like commentary on like we all know how maps are horrible, but the map is supposed to be that negative experience, and like I think that is like a specific. I don't think that's anti-design. I think that's like a very specific, difficult kind of design. I'm thinking in like movie Vertigo is what came to mind. Like the experience when he's like on the top of the tower and he looks down and you have that like kind of disorienting, wiggly. And like if that shot lasted 15 minutes as opposed to a couple seconds, like, that wouldn't be a good shot. It would be nauseating. And so, like I think a lot of these things that could be like designed for negative experiences is like just like a matter of like timing and fine tuning, like of like maybe there's just like too much of that math, or like it's not broken up in the right ways. And I think that's like another side of it where you can kind of design to like illustrate a character having a negative experience and make the player have that negative experience, but you don't want to do like an hour of that. You want to give them a taste of it, and so they can extrapolate. That's probably one.
Oh no, yeah. I mean, I think the negative experience thing falls into a lot of the same category as irony to me. In that, I mean, I don't think it's the same thing. I think you're right to differentiate them, but I think it has the same problem of like to an uninformed user. I don't know if I could differentiate. I don't think an uninformed user can differentiate between the math and the map. Right? I think to an uninformed user, they're the same. They're the same thing. They're bad and unpleasant experiences.
Right. And it's confusing if you have both next to each other. I think like. If
yeah.
You have a lot of just like badly done shots, and then one that's supposed to be badly done, like, oh, that's the one that's like art, but then the other ones were bad. But like, I think, you have to have an absence of the other stuff.
Yeah, my wife and I had this amazing fight about the Aronofsky movie Mother,
I haven't seen it.
about whether it was meant to be parody or not. Because he never cues it very strong. There's one cue, which is like the exclamation point in the title. That's like the only thing we could find that's like, this is supposed to be a parody. Because it's played very over the top straight. And my argument was, he never told me this is a parody, so this is a piece of crap, because clearly he thinks this is good and it's ridiculous. And her argument was, well, obviously it's a parody because it's so ridiculous. Right? And I think that's a space that I'm very interested in as a critic, because I think it's a really troubling space. Because if I don't know if Aronofsky meant that thing to be parodic or not. I deliberately don't read his stuff because I don't want to figure it out that way. The work should tell it to me. But like, it's interesting to me that exists, and it's to exactly that point. It's like, if you put 7 bad shots in and then a deliberately bad shot, I see 8 bad shots, right? And if you put 1 bad shot in the right way, I see an interesting bad shot that has a purpose, and that. But I know that because I understand the language of film, right? Well enough to put that together.
Just like on a film tangent, do you like his other movies?
Some of them, and some of them I don't. I like Pi. I like Black Swan, except the end, which I think goes over the top ridiculous. Okay. But then again, that it gets into the same argument. Is like, is that supposed to be over the top ridiculous? And I'm like, no. The rest of the movie's serious. This doesn't make any sense. And to her, to Melanie, it's like, no, of course it's ridiculous. She has feathers. Like, why would she have feathers? And I'm like, because he's tacky. It's like, no, because he means it. And it's like, that's the debate. That's like, well, maybe I'm just not. Maybe there are other parodic cues, right? Like, maybe Aronofsky at a certain point uses this camera angle. It's so ridiculous, right? The framing of the shot's so ridiculous that anybody who knows film would be like, oh, okay. Or like, I like Tarantino. I think Tarantino is a good example of this too. That like if you understand film, Tarantino is a completely different director than if you don't. I don't understand film that well, so I don't catch 95% of his references. So to me, they're just cool, slick films that are like, that have a really, really shiny surface, and they're not that deep, but the surface is so shiny, it's like awesome. And then other people are like, oh, this is an homage to 500 different things. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. Doesn't mean anything to me. I'm just watching it because of the slick exterior. But then I don't think does Tarantino care? Does it matter? Is it just for that audience and that's okay? But then I think that Tarantino is an interesting example of work because it's still consumable by me, even though I don't get 95% of what he's doing. Like, I'm literally just like dipping my toe into the giant ocean that is Tarantino's film knowledge. I still walk away engaged because it's been designed as a film that I can engage with. And that's why I'm using this term anti-design a bit. It's because like I think that you can do both of those things at the same time.
Reference that might make sense in this in Austin, every single year he would do this thing called the Butt Numbathon with Harry Knowles, who's like another huge film nerd, and Tarantino would bring his own 16 and 35 millimeter prints of all these movies that inspired him to make the weird, slick kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And if you could watch his whole curated list for 24 hours at the end, you got like a free t-shirt and stuff. Because you could get up before every single movie and talk about it and talk about like why it was different, why it was impactful. So going back to this whole curation thing, like there were moments where like, yeah, it was totally irony maybe. Like he was being completely ironic, but then it didn't make sense until he had to explain it to you. And yeah, it was a small group. It could have been bigger. Obviously, he still found the secret to success because his stuff blew up. So. Yeah.
What did you want to say in the back? I don't want to cut you out.
I guess I was wondering there's been this large conversation about sort of literacy in games, and I think just like assuming that someone needs to be literate in something like any of these things. Isn't that kind of the fault of commercial games? Isn't that partially the fault of these critics who are making these taste sort of qualifications? And isn't this also the issue of accessibility to have people be able to make these things? Like for instance, Roger Ebert and people like critics like that. Started becoming more popular when film was becoming more and more accessible for other people to make. And for instance, the rise of the punk movement was people having more and more accessibility to be able to use, instruments like guitars, and also acknowledging that, you don't have to, quote unquote, know how to play the guitar to play guitar music. And that was also, I think, and also a lost idea of what the quote unquote indie game movement turned into. Like, in history, in the 90s, there were people just kind of making games and releasing them on the internet. In about 2008, all of these things became more commercial with Steam. And then if you see like the history of something like TIG Source, these kind of ideas, everyone just like kind of shot off and saw things like Minecraft and Super Meat Boy, and tried to gain commercial success, and also things like IGF. I feel like turned these things that were maybe like maybe a pure sort of idea of just creation into this commercial thing. So isn't it that like commercial games in general have ruined?
That's a great question.
Authenticity, irony, and outsider art. Do you think that like like that is responsible for like any of this argument? Because if people just played like whatever that wasn't like advertised to them, because I grew up playing games online because I wasn't able to buy games like from the store very often. So it's like, I have because I don't have like commercial literacy. What is that? What is that? You know what I mean? It's just like different forms of literacy. Like people in Africa, like a long time ago, there was a study where someone brought like a photo to like a tribe in Africa, and they didn't understand that it was like a photo. They just saw it as like a piece of paper because they'd never really like seen a photo before. So it's just like why does that matter?
Well, because I think aesthetically it doesn't, right? Who cares? But it doesn't change the world very much if we like pursue one kind of game or another. So yeah, the commercial industry is responsible, and like there were very deliberate decisions made that were largely, like I said, largely because of the way the U.S. toy industry worked and things were sold in stores that led to this like ridiculous gendering of games. That like it's funny, Nintendo kind of caused and then Nintendo kind of stopped, like on both sides. Like Nintendo was sort of on both sides of this one. But I think that the question of like asking the industry to do something is always like very problematic to me, because what the industry wants to do is sell, and they have this very direct relationship to selling, and they might, and I'm not hyper capitalist, I believe they should act to include more voices, and we should show that kind of stuff. And I think the success of certain things in like film and television right now should be indicating to people like, yeah, get more voices in, because like the only superhero movie that really made money last year was Wonder Woman. And it made a lot of money, so maybe we should change things just for money, right? Like don't even worry about the gender representation. Just, do you want to make money? This seemed to do pretty well, and like that stuff just boggles my mind. But like you can't force that. Like that's just something that the industry is going to decide on its own. And it's probably going to be backward. It's probably going to be conservative. They're all super risk averse. Like it's not going to happen. The space where I think it can happen, and this is why I'm having this conversation generally, is in criticism. Like criticism is the thing that can make this work. Because critics can make that happen. Punk did happen in part, and I think everything you said is true, like, because means of production got cheaper. It happened in part because people made a decision aesthetically that they could make work when they were told they couldn't before. But it also happened because of zines. Because people started talking about it, and it created a culture around itself. Like, it became like an identity. Right? And I feel like what I feel like is deeply, deeply missing from games all over, like generally, is a deep cultural sense of identity. That's not like gamer, right? But that's like something else that could kind of create these connections. And I think you're totally right. And I think that will amplify new voices, and I think it will provide new opportunities for people to create, and will create new work. But the problem is that you have to have that ecosystem. Right? It's got to exist in that ecosystem, and this is like what things like baby castles are for. So like that's why I'm saying it here, because I think it's awesome, right? I think it's awesome that these things exist, and I want to support things like this personally, like things like this, and and Death by Audio Arcade, and Tony Roca's conference, different, like, what was Tony Roca's conference? Why I forget, Gamer X, right? Like, I want to support things like that, because, like, that's where this can happen, right? Is in places where people who are smart about games, who have curatorial taste, and can talk about them, can then bring that out to a broader audience, right? Because I think that's how it happened, is that people started to pass around zines. Because they couldn't hear all that music. Like, a lot of that stuff was happening in Boston and DC and LA. Like, how did you get access to it? Well, you passed around tapes, and then you read these mimeographed things that got passed around like crazy. And then you sort of knew, like, you heard who Fugazi was, and you were like, oh, that's interesting. That's cool. I want to get that tape, I guess, at that time. Right? And then, like, then you could get a mixtape of it and hear it, and then you were in, right? And then you wrote your own zine. And that became the world, right? And then we all kind of knew about that world. And I was never a good punk, right? I was always a very, very, very shallow part of the pool punk, right? I had my friend Noel Billig, just to give credit where due, who dived headfirst in and got really serious and, like, read zines and helped produce zines and went to shows and eventually married somebody who was connected to Matador, so he got very, very deep. But, like, he taught me all that stuff, and I sort of carried it out. But that only was possible because the whole ecosystem existed. So I think you're right. Yeah, I mean, like, did the commercial industry cause this in part? Sure, but it caused it because it moved, right? Like, it was always going to leave something out. It was always going to be problematic, and, you know, the past was racist and sexist and homophobic and horrible, and so it did racist and sexist and homophobic horrible things, right? Like, we know that. How do we fix it? I think we fix it the way film fixed it. That's what I see as the solution, is that, like, in the middle part of the 20th century, in France, people making films were like, we hate the films that are being made, we want to make different films, and they wrote in newspapers critiques of films that got people to watch films, right? And that is how film changed, because suddenly people had a vocabulary for film, and they were looking for these things that didn't even know that they were there in first, but now they knew. And that created this conversation that allowed criticism to become a higher art, that allowed you to have a Siskel and Ebert, that allowed them to reach back. And that became this virtuous circle where now everybody talks about film as though we know film, right? And a movie like Moonlight can win, like, giant awards because we're all fluent enough in film that we can look at something like that and talk about representation and, like, interesting location and complex themes in a film. And we're not all just watching, like churned out Westerns that were being produced in Hollywood at that time, right? Like, and I think that, like, so how do we change the game industry to make it not all shooters where brown people get killed? Probably what we need to do is we need to create a culture around people wanting to consume other things and seeing games as valuable for other things. And I think the way we do that is not by asking the industry to do it, because they won't, because they'll just keep making money making games where cis white males shoot brown people, right? But, like, if we want other games to be popular and to reach audiences, which I think is critical because that's how the whole culture changes, is if people consume them, then they make them work. Artists working on their own, doing their own thing, that's different to me. That's, like, a different question. And, like, that's really, like, about the means of production and making it work. And if you want to play the punk show that just your friends, like your other friends in your suburb in Ohio see, awesome for you, right? I think I totally agree with you. We solved that problem. That problem is done. Like, I think the interesting question now is, how does that work get amplified so that it reflects more in the commercial community, and so that we can start creating those changes so that more creators can move up, and so that, you know, and then, like, I think it solves a bunch of problems for me, and I'm going to get utopian, right? So that creators can make a living doing it, they can get recognition doing it, right? So that, like, you make a successful game and you don't get stuck making, like, you know, I think of, like why on earth did you make Super Meat Boy and then not get to make bigger things? How did that happen? Like, in any other industry, any other art industry, even the really shitty ones, someone would have been like, you're good, and pulled McMullen up and then given him like a few $1 million to make something crazy. And it doesn't happen in our industry because our industry is fucked when it comes to funding, right? That needs to change. But then also that it's not just the same people, like racially, the same people, gender, the same people, like in any identity category, the same people class-wise, which I think is the one we don't really talk about very much, but it's also very huge, right? Like they're not the people who just keep making the stuff either, that like other voices can get made. And there are institutions to support that in other art forms. And as broken as they are, they're better than we are, because new media is still at the bottom feeding of funding. right? There are whole film institutions that just exist to give money to people of color to make films. Like they're the whole funds, that's the only purpose they have. And we have nothing like that, right? And I want us to have things like that because I personally believe in all of this stuff. I don't want everyone to design games the way I think are good, right? Like I have absolutely no interest in that at all. I want you to make things I hate. Like, I want you to make things I will argue vociferously against. I want you to make things that burn down the Buddha that I created, right? And that tell me that Diner Dash is a piece of shit. Like, I want work like that because that's how art grows, right? And I feel good as a teacher and as someone in my 40s when I see people in their 20s saying shit that I think is ridiculous, right? But saying it smart and making good work. Like, I feel great because I'm like, oh, good, we're going to survive. And 80 years from now, I'll be vindicated because I'll realize that I was great. Right? We just go through this cycle where they hate me for a while, and it's cool. Like how tacky and commercial I am, I guess, is probably where it's going to come from. But you know what I mean? Like, I want those cycles to exist, but I think this is, and it's nice because this is the time. We have the work. The work is good. We have a lot of people making the work. We have a lot of students interested in the work. All we have to do is sort of tell a new audience that we exist the right way so that they can see like all these like shiny little gems in the rough, and then something magical happens. We can create this new culture. And like, I would love to see a punk rock of games, like a real punk rock of games, but a punk rock of games with everything that punk rock had, right? Like a culture, a costume, magazines, like shows, like a world of people who identify with each other by saying fuck you to GTA, like as they sit around playing their games, right? And like that's a world I think we can get to. I think we're really close, but I think we have to kind of think a little bit about why we give Cartlife an award at our festivals if that's what we want, right? Because I don't think that's how we get there. Anyway, it's gone on for a while. Sorry.
I was gonna say I think that's good. But everybody, thank you for coming. Hang out for a bit. Blake's in the back. You can discuss more with him and also donate piggy castles or purchase some liquid refreshments as well. Nick, I'd really like to thank you for coming. Like this is a great conversation, and I want to thank you guys, the audience, for coming as well. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and feel free to continue talking too.